You are destroying yourself not through obvious vices or acknowledged weaknesses, but through your goodness, through your noble intentions, through your commitment to being moral and responsible and selfless person who does what is right, regardless of personal cost. This destruction does not look like destruction from outside, appears as virtue and dedication and admirable self-sacrifice, is praised by others who see only your service and your commitment and your willingness to put others first. But beneath the appearance of goodness is architecture of harm, is systematic dismantling of your own well-being, is slow erosion of everything that makes life worth living in service of abstractions and obligations and ideals that demand everything while providing nothing. The architecture of this self-destruction is built from good intentions. Each decision seems justified and righteous. Each sacrifice feels necessary. Each suppression of your own needs appears as moral requirement rather than as self-betrayal. You are not being destroyed by external forces or by malicious others, but by your own commitment to being good, by beliefs about what virtue requires, by internal demands that masquerade as conscience but are actually psychological tyranny disguised as moral necessity. This is most insidious form of personal destruction because it is invisible to the person experiencing it, is defended against recognition by the very goodness that creates it, is maintained through belief that suffering in service of others or ideals or duties is noble rather than recognizing it as pathology that destroys you while calling itself virtue. Understanding how good intentions lead to personal destruction requires examining the mechanisms through which morality becomes a weapon you use against yourself, through which virtue becomes vice, through which trying to be good creates conditions for your own annihilation. The first mechanism through which good intentions destroy you is through the tyranny of the should, the relentless internal voice that tells you what you should do, who you should be, how you should feel, what you should want, creating impossible standards that can never be met, and demanding constant self-sacrifice in pursuit of ideals that were never yours but were internalized from parents or religion or culture or ideology that convinced you that goodness requires self-negation. The should is experienced as moral imperative, as voice of conscience, as legitimate guide to right action, but is actually psychological violence, is constant judgment and criticism and demand that you be different than you are. You should be more patient, more generous, more selfless, more productive, more disciplined, more grateful, more forgiving, more understanding, more willing to sacrifice, more capable of loving those who harm you, more able to transcend your own needs in service of others. The should is never satisfied because satisfaction would eliminate its function, which is not to guide you toward genuine goodness, but to maintain constant state of inadequacy and guilt that prevents you from ever feeling acceptable or worthy or allowed to prioritize your own well-being. This tyranny creates architecture of self-destruction because you organize your entire life around meeting these impossible demands. Sacrifice your actual desires and needs and capacities in attempt to become who the should tells you that you must be. Exhaust yourself pursuing standards that were designed to be unachievable. Interpret every failure to meet the demands as evidence of moral inadequacy, rather than as evidence that the demands themselves are unreasonable and destructive. The good intention is to be a moral person, to live according to principles, to be someone who does right thing regardless of personal cost. But the mechanism turns this intention into weapon, uses your desire to be good to create constant self-attack, transforms morality into impossible burden that crushes you beneath weight of demands that can never be satisfied. You are destroying yourself through trying to be good enough, through believing that virtue requires constant self-sacrifice, through accepting that your needs and desires and limits are obstacles to goodness, rather than recognizing that true virtue would include care for yourself rather than only care for others or for abstractions. The second mechanism is the addiction to being needed, the way you construct identity around being a person who helps and supports and sacrifices for others, who gains worth through service who feels valuable only when providing what others need, or fixing their problems, or carrying their burdens. This appears as generosity and compassion, but is actually dependency disguised as virtue, is need to be needed that masquerades as selfless giving, is compulsive caretaking that serves your psychological requirement to feel important rather than genuine care for others' well-being. The addiction creates architecture of self-destruction because you cannot say no without experiencing existential threat to your identity, cannot establish boundaries without feeling you are being selfish or abandoning your purpose, cannot prioritize your own needs without guilt that feels unbearable. You take on more than you can handle because refusing would mean facing that your worth does not actually depend on constant service, would require developing identity that is not organized around being needed, would force recognition that much of your helping is about you rather than about those you claim to be serving. This compulsive helping destroys you through exhaustion and resentment, and through preventing development of genuine self that exists independent of service role, through creating relationships where you are used rather than valued, through attracting people who want what you provide rather than who you actually are, through ensuring you never have time or energy for your own life because you are always managing everyone else's. The good intention is to be a helpful person, to make positive difference, to be someone others can count on. But the mechanism turns this into addiction, where your well-being depends on others needing you, where you unconsciously ensure that people remain dependent because their independence would threaten your identity. You enable rather than help, create dependencies rather than empowering others, sacrifice yourself not because it is necessary, but because being needed is only way you know how to feel valuable. The destruction is masked as virtue, is praised by those who benefit from your inability to stop giving, is reinforced by social narratives that celebrate self-sacrifice while ignoring its costs. You are destroying yourself while believing you are being noble, are creating conditions for your own breakdown while experiencing it as moral obligation. The third mechanism is perfectionism, disguised as conscientiousness, the belief that anything worth doing must be done perfectly, that mistakes are moral failures rather than inevitable aspects of being human, that your worth depends on flawless performance rather than on effort or growth or simple facts of your existence. This perfectionism appears as high standards and dedication to excellence, but is actually self-torture, is impossible, demand that generates constant anxiety and prevents satisfaction regardless of what you accomplish, because nothing ever meets the standards you have internalized. The perfectionism creates architecture of self-destruction through paralysis and procrastination, through preventing you from attempting what you might not do perfectly, through making every task feel overwhelming because perfect execution is required, through destroying enjoyment in activities that become performances to be judged rather than experiences to be lived. You cannot write because the writing might not be perfect, cannot create because the creation might reveal your limitations, cannot try new things because initial incompetence feels intolerable when perfection is the standard. The perfectionism also destroys through making you brittle and defensive, through requiring that you hide all flaws and mistakes, through preventing vulnerability and genuine connection because being seen as imperfect feels like being exposed as fraud, through creating constant performance anxiety where every interaction is test you might fail. You cannot be wrong because being wrong means being worthless, cannot make mistakes because mistakes prove you are inadequate, cannot acknowledge limitations because limitations contradict the perfect image you believe you must maintain. The good intention is to do your best, to be competent and capable, to produce work of quality. But the mechanism turns this into tyranny, where your best is never good enough, where competence requires perfection, where quality means flawlessness that is impossible to achieve. You are destroying yourself through standards that were designed to make you feel perpetually inadequate, through beliefs about worth that tie it to impossible achievements, through refusing to accept that being human means being imperfect, and that trying to transcend this limitation through perfect performance is not virtue but is psychological violence you inflict on yourself. The perfectionism prevents the very excellence it claims to pursue, because fear of imperfection prevents attempting, because anxiety about failure sabotages performance, because the constant self-criticism destroys confidence and creativity and the willingness to take risks that excellence requires. The fourth mechanism is the belief that your needs are less important than others' needs, that prioritizing yourself is selfishness while sacrificing yourself is virtue. That good person puts everyone else first and attends to their own well-being only after everyone else has been served, which of course never happens because there is always someone else whose needs can claim priority over your own. This belief creates architecture of self-destruction through systematic neglect of everything that would sustain you, through treating your own well-being as luxury that must be earned through serving others, rather than as foundation that must be maintained to have anything to offer. You do not rest because others need you. Do not pursue your interests because time should be spent on more important things. Do not maintain friendships or activities that bring joy, because these feel like indulgences when others have problems that need solving, or when work demands your attention, or when family obligations must be met. Your life becomes entirely instrumental, exists only to serve purposes beyond itself, has no intrinsic value that justifies caring for it simply because it is yours. This systematic self-neglect destroys through depletion and burnout, through creating life that feels empty because it contains nothing for you, through ensuring that you have nothing left to give because you never replenish what you spend, through making you resentful and bitter, even while you continue performing the service that is destroying you. The good intention is to be generous and selfless, to care about others, to not be narcissistic or self-absorbed. But the mechanism turns this into belief that caring for yourself is moral failure, that having needs makes you weak or selfish, that your well-being does not matter or matters less than everyone else's. You are destroying yourself while calling it virtue, are creating conditions for your own collapse while believing you are being noble, are sacrificing what is necessary for sustainable living while experiencing the sacrifice as moral requirement rather than as pathological self-betrayal. The destruction is invisible until it is catastrophic, accumulates silently while you maintain appearance of coping, builds toward breakdown that appears sudden but was actually a result of years of systematic neglect disguised as selflessness. The fifth mechanism is the need to be a good person, to maintain identity as moral and righteous, and on the right side, to never be the villain or the one who causes harm or the one who acts from selfish motives. This need creates architecture of self-destruction through requiring constant monitoring of your own behavior, through making every action subject to moral evaluation, through preventing spontaneity and authentic response, because these might reveal that you are not as good as you need to believe you are, through creating constant anxiety about whether you are being good enough or whether you have failed to meet moral standards. This need to be good also creates destruction through preventing acknowledgement of your own shadow, through requiring that you deny your capacity for selfishness and cruelty and pettiness, because acknowledging these would threaten the good person identity, through forcing you to project your darkness onto others who become enemies, carrying what you cannot own in yourself. The good person cannot be angry, so the anger is suppressed or is justified as righteous, rather than being acknowledged as anger. The good person cannot be selfish, so the selfishness is denied or is reframed as taking care of yourself so you can better serve others. This creates split between who you perform being and who you actually are, between the moral image you maintain and the actual human with flaws and limitations and dark impulses who exists beneath the performance. The split requires constant energy to maintain, creates internal tension between performance and reality, prevents integration of shadow that is necessary for psychological wholeness, ensures that you remain fragmented and at war with yourself while believing you are being virtuous. The good intention is to be an ethical person, to live according to values, to not cause unnecessary harm, but the mechanism turns this into compulsive performance of goodness that prevents authentic living, into need for moral certainty that requires denying complexity and ambiguity, into identity that is so fragile that any recognition of your own darkness feels like existential threat. You are destroying yourself through refusing to be human, through demanding that you be only light without darkness, through believing that goodness requires eliminating rather than integrating the shadow, through making your worth dependent on maintaining impossible moral purity. The sixth mechanism is sacrificing yourself for abstract ideals or causes that demand everything while providing nothing, that require you to subordinate your life to purposes that transcend individual well-being, that justify any personal cost in service of greater good, that may never be achieved and whose achievement would not actually compensate for what was sacrificed. The ideology or cause or movement becomes more important than your life. Your suffering becomes noble when framed as service to the cause. Your destruction becomes meaningful when interpreted as martyrdom for principles that matter more than individual happiness or health or survival. This creates architecture of self-destruction through making your life instrumental to abstractions, through treating your well-being as acceptable sacrifice for ideological purity or political victory or religious salvation, or any other transcendent purpose that justifies subordinating actual human lives to theoretical goods. You work yourself to exhaustion for the cause, sacrifice relationships for ideological correctness, deny yourself pleasures or rest or care because these feel like betrayals of the principles you serve. Experience your suffering as badge of commitment rather than as warning that something is fundamentally wrong. The good intention is to serve something larger than yourself, to dedicate your life to meaningful purposes, to not be purely self-interested or absorbed only in personal gratification. But the mechanism turns this into fanaticism that destroys you in service of abstractions, into willingness to sacrifice anything, including your own well-being, for principles that do not actually care about you, into belief that your suffering is meaningful when it serves the cause, rather than recognizing that the cause that demands your destruction is not actually serving good, but is parasitic ideology that consumes its adherents. You are destroying yourself while believing you are serving higher purpose, are creating conditions for your own annihilation while experiencing it as noble dedication, are treating your life as expendable in service of causes that will continue without you, and that will find new adherents to consume when you have been used up. The destruction is masked as meaning, is justified through narratives about sacrifice and service, is reinforced by communities that celebrate martyrdom while benefiting from your self-destruction. The seventh mechanism is the belief that suffering is virtue, that difficulty proves worthiness, that the hard path is automatically the right path, that if something feels difficult or painful, it must be good for you, while if something feels easy or pleasant, it must be suspect or indulgent or spiritually inferior. This belief creates architecture of self-destruction through making you choose suffering when ease is available, through interpreting your pain as evidence of moral superiority rather than as signal that something needs to change, through preventing you from seeking or accepting help, because receiving help would mean the easy path, which would mean being less virtuous. You stay in relationships that harm you because leaving would be easy path, remain in work that destroys you because quitting would be giving up, continue commitments that exhaust you because breaking them would be failure. Choose the difficult option in every situation because difficulty has become how you prove worth. The suffering becomes identity, becomes how you know you are a good person, becomes evidence of your dedication and commitment and moral fiber. You are addicted to difficulty, cannot trust ease, must make everything harder than it needs to be to feel like you are being virtuous. The good intention is to not take easy way out, to be willing to do hard things, to not avoid difficulty when difficulty is necessary. But the mechanism turns this into compulsive choosing of suffering, into belief that pain is proof of virtue, into making your life harder than it needs to be, while calling this moral strength. You are destroying yourself through manufactured difficulty, through rejecting help and ease and pleasure as if these are moral failures, through believing that the only path worth taking is the one that hurts. Conclusion: the architecture of evil built from good intentions operates through multiple mechanisms that transform virtue into self-destruction. The tyranny of impossible moral demands, the addiction to being needed, perfectionism that prevents living, belief that your needs do not matter, compulsive performance of goodness, sacrifice for abstract ideals, an equation of suffering with virtue. Each mechanism appears righteous, is defended as moral necessity, is experienced as what good person does, rather than being recognized as psychological pathology that destroys you while calling itself virtue. The destruction is invisible because it is praised, is reinforced by social narratives about selflessness and dedication, is defended against recognition by your own investment in being good person who would never destroy themselves. You cannot see that your goodness is killing you because seeing would require facing that much of what you call virtue is actually violence you inflict on yourself, that your noble intentions have created conditions for your own annihilation, that trying to be good according to impossible standards is not moral achievement but is self-betrayal. The good intentions destroy you precisely because they are experienced as good, because you cannot question them without feeling you are being selfish or immoral, because recognizing the destruction would require abandoning identity built around these intentions, would mean facing that you have been complicit in your own harm while believing you were being virtuous. The architecture is stable because it is self-reinforcing, because each mechanism supports the others, because the whole structure is defended by your need to see yourself as good person. Breaking free requires recognizing that true virtue would include care for yourself, that goodness that destroys you is not actually goodness, that intentions matter less than outcomes, and the outcome of your good intentions is your systematic destruction. It requires questioning the moral demands you have internalized, establishing boundaries even when doing so feels selfish, accepting imperfection as human rather than as failure, prioritizing your own well-being as necessity rather than as indulgence, integrating shadow rather than performing purity, choosing causes that honor rather than consume you, seeking ease rather than compulsive difficulty. The work is difficult because it requires dismantling beliefs about virtue that have organized your entire life, requires facing that much of what you thought was noble was actually pathological, requires building new understanding of goodness that includes, rather than excludes, your own well-being. But the alternative is continuing the destruction, is allowing good intentions to complete the architecture of your annihilation, is dying in service of abstractions that never cared whether you lived or died as long as you served them while you could.